In the quiet southern town of Millwood, where the past lingers in every corner and change is met with wary eyes, Dr. Celeste Harper makes a bold return after decades away. A skilled and composed physician, Celeste hoped her hometown would welcome her vision to transform healthcare and bridge deep-rooted divides. But instead, she's met with resistance, whispers of doubt, and the weight of old wounds she thought she'd left behind. As Celeste navigates the tensions of a town unwilling to confront its flaws, her resolve is tested by powerful opponents like Dean Mitchell, a local businessman intent on maintaining the status quo. The two clashes repeatedly, their confrontations revealing Millwood's deeper struggles with identity, community, and justice. Yet amid the resistance, unexpected allies like Angela Jenkins, a young woman determined to support change, give Celeste the strength to push forward. When a late-night emergency brings Dean to her door, desperately seeking help for his granddaughter, the delicate balance of their rivalry shifts. This turning point sparks ripples across the town, forcing everyone to reevaluate their beliefs and roles in shaping a better future. Will Celeste's unwavering courage and kindness be enough to break through Millwood's barriers and inspire real change? Or will the weight of resistance prove too great? Join us in this gripping tale of conflict, redemption, and the power of a community determined to heal itself. The late afternoon sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the Tulane Highway as Dr. Celeste Harper drove toward Millwood. The tires of her sedan hummed steadily on the cracked asphalt, but her mind churned with unease. On the surface, her return was a practical decision. After her mother's passing, there was no one left to care for the family home, and the town's struggling clinic needed a capable physician. Yet beneath the practicality lay a sea of doubts. It had been nearly 25 years since she left Millwood, a town she once described as small enough to know everyone's name, but big enough to carry secrets. The last time she'd driven these roads, she'd been an ambitious college graduate heading to medical school in Atlanta. Her dreams were as vast as the city skyline she had chased, and Millwood had been a place to escape, not return to. The family home came into view, a weathered bungalow perched at the end of a tree-lined street. The sight made her chest tighten. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged slightly at one corner. The large oak tree in the front yard, once her childhood sanctuary, now loomed like a sentinel over the neglected yard. She pulled into the gravel driveway, cut the engine, and sat in silence. Celeste let out a slow breath, gathering herself before stepping out of the car. The air smelled of earth and faintly of pine, a scent she had forgotten but instantly recognized. Her shoes crunched on the gravel as she approached the front door, the key cool and unfamiliar in her hand. When the door creaked open, the house greeted her with a stale, musty smell. Dust motes floated in the slant of sunlight cutting through the half-drawn curtains. The living room looked much as it had when she was a child. The faded couch, the coffee table her father had built, and the collection of mismatched chairs all stood as relics of a time gone by. Her mother's ceramic knickknacks lined the shelves, still arranged with care. But the stillness felt heavy. Celeste dropped her bags by the door and wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Her mother's absence was palpable, like a hollow space in every room. In the kitchen, a calendar from 2 years ago still hung on the wall, its pages curling at the edges. The fridge hummed quietly, but its emptiness matched the quiet of the house. She made her way to her old bedroom, pausing in the doorway. The space was smaller than she remembered, the pink walls and faded posters relics of a girl who had believed she would one day change the world. Celeste sat on the edge of the bed and ran a hand over the worn quilt her mother had made. The memories came rushing back, her father reading to her at bedtime, her mother calling her to dinner, the muffled sound of their voices late at night discussing bills and worries they never wanted her to hear. Yet not all the memories were warm. There had been whispers in the town when her father, a black man, had taken a teaching job at the high school. There were comments that made their way back to her about how certain people didn't belong in certain places. Celeste learned to keep her head down, to excel quietly, and to dream of a life far away. Now, sitting in her old room, the weight of those memories pressed down on her. She had come back for practical reasons, but the emotional reality was far more complicated. The next morning, Celeste woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. She brewed herself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, staring out at the overgrown yard. Across the street, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Beatrice Miller, waved from her own porch. Celeste hesitated before raising her hand in return. Beatrice made her way across the street with a cane in one hand and a basket in the other. Celeste stood as the older woman approached. "Well, I'll be. Celeste Harper, is that you?" Beatrice's voice was warm, her eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "Yes, ma'am," Celeste replied, managing a small smile. "It's been a long time. It surely has. I almost didn't believe it when I heard you were coming back. Welcome home, dear. I brought you some muffins. Thought you might not have had time to shop yet." Celeste took the basket, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." Beatrice smiled. "You're welcome. If you need anything, you just holler. I know this house must feel mighty lonely without your mama in it. She was a good woman." "She was," Celeste said softly, her throat tightening. As Beatrice made her way back across the street, Celeste felt a flicker of gratitude. Perhaps not everyone in Millwood saw her return as an intrusion. Later that day, Celeste drove to the clinic where she would start work the following week. The building was modest, its brick facade worn but serviceable. Inside, the waiting area was small, with mismatched chairs and outdated magazines. A young receptionist greeted her with a polite smile and led her to meet Dr. Robert King, the clinic's director. Dr. King was a wiry man in his late 60s, with graying hair and a brusque demeanor. He gave her a firm handshake and launched into a tour of the facility. "We do the best we can with what we've got," he said, gesturing to the exam rooms, which were clean but sparsely equipped. "Most of our patients are low-income or uninsured, so resources are always tight. You'll see a bit of everything here: diabetes, hypertension, the occasional emergency." Celeste nodded, taking in the space. It was a far cry from the modern hospital where she had spent most of her career, but it was clear the staff cared deeply about their patients. As the tour ended, Dr. King stopped and looked at her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "So, what made you decide to come back? Millwood isn't exactly the kind of place most people come running back to." Celeste hesitated. She had rehearsed her answer, but now found it difficult to put into words. "I guess I felt like it was time to give something back," she said finally. Dr. King nodded slowly. "Well, we can use all the help we can get. Just be prepared. This town can be set in its ways." "I figured as much," Celeste said, a wry smile tugging at her lips. That evening, as Celeste sat on the porch eating one of Beatrice's muffins, the doubts crept back in. She had always been good at holding herself together, at staying composed no matter the situation. But being back in Millwood, with its mix of familiar faces and old ghosts, was testing her resolve. The town felt like a puzzle. She wasn't sure she wanted to solve a place filled with both potential and pitfalls. Her gaze drifted to the oak tree in the yard, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. She remembered climbing it as a child, feeling invincible as she looked out over the neighborhood. Now, as an adult, the world felt far more complicated. Celeste pulled her jacket tighter against the evening chill and resolved to take things one day at a time. She had come back to Millwood for a reason, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. The sharp scent of antiseptic hit Celeste as she pushed open the glass doors of Millwood Medical Clinic. The morning sun had yet to burn away the slight chill in the air, and her heels clicked softly against the tiled floor as she stepped inside. The waiting area was already half full, the hum of quiet conversations punctuated by the occasional cough or rustle of paper. Celeste had hoped to slip in unnoticed, but the receptionist, a young woman with curly auburn hair and a name tag that read Janie, spotted her immediately. "Dr. Harper," Janie called, a bright smile on her face. She motioned for Celeste to come closer, earning curious glances from a few patients in the waiting area. "Good morning," Celeste said, adjusting the strap of her bag. "You're early. Dr. King's still in the back, but I'll let him know you're here. I've got to say, everyone's been buzzing about you starting. We haven't had a new doctor in. Well, longer than I've been here, Janie said, her voice warm and welcoming. Celeste offered a polite smile. I'm just here to help where I can. Janie leaned inconspiratorially. You've got your work cut out for you, but we're lucky to have you. You let me know if you need anything, okay? Thank you, Janie. I appreciate it. Celeste moved to take a seat in the waiting area, but before she could settle, Dr. King appeared in the hallway. His white coat hung loosely on his lean frame, and his clipboard was tucked under one arm. Harper, he called, his no-nonsense tone cutting through the room. Let's get started. The day began with a quick tour of the clinic's operational details. Dr. King walked her through everything, from the limited medical supplies to the outdated patient record system. Celeste listened attentively, taking mental notes as they moved from one cramped room to another. In the break room, which doubled as an office, King handed her a file. Your first patient of the day, he said. Evelyn Hayes. She's a regular diabetes, arthritis, hypertension, a walking textbook of chronic conditions. Celeste glanced at the file, noting the neatly typed summary of Evelyn's medical history. Got it. As she entered the exam room, she was greeted by a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s. Evelyn sat stiffly on the exam table, her cane propped beside her. Her expression softened slightly as Celeste introduced herself. New doctor, huh? Evelyn said, her southern drawl thick. I was wondering when they'd get some fresh blood in here. Not that Dr. King's bad, mind you, but Lord knows that man's been run ragged for years. I'm here to take some of that load off him, Celeste said with a reassuring smile. Let's see how we can get you feeling better today. As Celeste went through the exam, Evelyn's guarded demeanor began to ease. They talked about her health and her grandchildren, and by the time the visit ended, Evelyn's tone was almost cheerful. You're all right, Doc, Evelyn said as she slid off the table. I think we'll get along just fine. The morning passed in a blur of patients, each with their own story and set of challenges. A young man who hadn't been managing his asthma properly. A factory worker with chronic back pain from years of heavy lifting. A single mother with a sick toddler and no insurance. The cases were often straightforward, but the underlying issues, the poverty, the lack of resources, the mistrust of the medical system added layers of complexity Celeste hadn't encountered in her previous practice. By lunchtime, she was both physically and emotionally drained. She sat in the break room with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the clinic's small parking lot. The gray sedan she recognized from her earlier years sat near the edge, and it reminded her of the patients she had watched her parents care for, neighbors, friends, and even strangers. As she took a sip of coffee, Dr. King entered the room and sat across from her. How's it going so far, he asked. Busy, Celeste admitted, but it's a good kind of busy. People here need more than just medical care, though. They need someone to advocate for them. King nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's true, but advocating doesn't always go over well in a place like Millwood. Folks here don't like change, even when it's for the better. You'll see. Celeste met his gaze. That doesn't mean it isn't worth trying. Dr. King gave her a small, almost approving smile. You got the fire for it. Just don't let it burn you out. That evening, Celeste stayed late to finish charting patient notes. The clinic was quiet, the reception desk empty, and the sound of her pen scratching against paper was the only noise. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard the soft chime of the front door opening. She stepped into the hallway to find a young woman standing there, cradling a baby wrapped in a faded blanket. The woman's face was pale and tired, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Excuse me, the woman said, her voice trembling. I didn't know if you'd still be open, but I didn't know where else to go. It's okay, Celeste said gently. Come with me. She led the woman to an exam room and began asking questions as she checked the baby's vitals. The little girl, no more than a year old, had a slight fever and wheezed faintly as she breathed. What's her name? Celeste asked. Amelia, the woman replied. She's been sick for a couple of days, but I don't have insurance, and I couldn't afford to take her anywhere. You did the right thing bringing her here, Celeste said. We'll take care of her. As Celeste worked, she noticed the woman's hands shaking. When she pressed gently, the woman admitted she hadn't eaten that day, having used what little money she had to buy medicine for Amelia. Without hesitation, Celeste stepped out and rummaged through the break room's small pantry, finding a granola bar and a bottle of water. She handed them to the woman, who accepted them with quiet gratitude. Once Amelia was stable and the prescriptions arranged, Celeste walked the woman to the door. "I'll check on her tomorrow," Celeste said. "If you ever need help, don't wait. Just come back here, no matter the time." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." As they stepped out into the cool night, Celeste noticed headlights in the parking lot. It was Mrs. Beatrice Miller, her old neighbor, sitting in her car. "Evening, Dr. Harper," Beatrice called, stepping out with a knowing smile. "I figured you'd still be working. Brought you some supper. You can't live off clinic coffee alone." Celeste blinked, momentarily stunned. Beatrice handed her a Tupperware container filled with chicken and rice. "You're doing good here, Celeste," Beatrice said, her tone gentle. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it." As Celeste drove home that night, the weight of the day lingered, but so did the warmth of unexpected kindness. It was a small moment, but it sparked something in her, a reminder that even in the hardest places, hope could take root. The morning light poured through the clinic's windows as Celeste adjusted her stethoscope. Another busy day loomed ahead, but her thoughts lingered on the encounter from the previous evening. The image of the young mother cradling her sick baby stayed with her, a vivid reminder of why she had returned to Millwood. By mid-morning, Celeste was deep into a patient's chart when she heard a voice she hadn't expected. Well, if it isn't little Celeste Harper. The voice was warm, with a slightly patronizing undertone. Celeste turned to see Ruby Simmons, her mother's old friend and a fixture of the local church. Ruby stood in the hallway, her broad smile framed by impeccably styled gray curls. "Ruby," Celeste said, forcing a polite smile. "It's nice to see you." Ruby leaned in for a quick hug, her floral perfume enveloping Celeste in a cloud of familiarity. "Your mama would be so proud of you coming back here to help. Not many people would do that." "Thank you," Celeste replied. Ruby's smile faltered slightly. "But, not everyone around here sees it the same way. Some folks, well, they think it's a little strange you coming back after all this time." Celeste stiffened but kept her tone neutral. "I'm here to help where I'm needed, Ruby. That hasn't changed." Ruby nodded quickly, as if retreating from the edge of something deeper. Of course. Just thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in." After Ruby left, Celeste leaned against the wall, her mind racing. The comment about people finding her return strange gnawed at her, though she knew it shouldn't. Millwood had always been a place where gossip moved faster than facts. That afternoon, Celeste decided to visit the local grocery store on her lunch break. She needed a change of scenery, and her pantry at home was woefully understocked. As she pushed her cart through the narrow aisles, she noticed a few familiar faces, people she hadn't seen since she was a teenager. Most greeted her warmly, but there were others who simply nodded or glanced away, their smiles polite but distant. As she reached for a can of coffee, she heard a voice behind her. "Well, look who it is." Celeste turned to see Dean Mitchell, the town's most prominent businessman and a man she had tried to avoid since her return. Dean had been a star athlete in high school, and though age had softened his frame, his smug expression was unchanged. "Dean," Celeste said evenly. He grinned, though there was no warmth in it. "Never thought I'd see you back here. I figured you were too big for a little place like Millwood." "I came back to help," Celeste replied, keeping her tone measured. Dean chuckled, the sound grating in her ears. "Well, good luck with that. Not much has changed around here, People like things the way they've always been." Celeste met his gaze, unflinching. Sometimes change is exactly what people need, whether they realize it or not. Dean's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Just don't go stirring up too much trouble. Document Millwood doesn't take kindly to that." With that, he walked away, leaving Celeste standing in the aisle, her hands tightening around the cart's handle. Back at the clinic, Celeste couldn't shake the encounter. Dean's words felt like a veiled warning, a reminder that her presence in Millwood was not universally welcomed. As the afternoon wore on, her unease deepened. When her shift ended, she found herself driving aimlessly through town. The familiar streets, with their mix of charming homes and boarded-up storefronts, stirred conflicting emotions. She pulled into the parking lot of the community center, the place where so many of her childhood memories were tied. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the sound of children's laughter echoing down the hall. She followed the noise to a large, brightly lit room where kids were gathered for an after-school program. "Celeste Harper, is that really you?" The voice came from Bethany Reed, one of Celeste's closest friends growing up. Bethany's hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and her smile was wide and genuine. "Bethany," Celeste said, her relief palpable as she hugged her old friend. "I heard you were back," Bethany said, stepping back to study her. "And now you're a doctor. Look at you, all fancy." Celeste laughed softly. "It's good to see you. How long have you been running the community center?" "Almost 10 years now," Bethany replied. "It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. These kids need a safe place to go, and Lord knows there aren't enough of those around here." As they talked, Celeste felt a sense of comfort she hadn't experienced since returning to Millwood. Bethany's warmth and easy laughter reminded her of simpler times, when they'd spent long summer afternoons riding bikes and dreaming about the future. Bethany glanced at her watch. "Hey, there's a town hall meeting tonight. You should come. They're talking about funding for the clinic, among other things. You might get a chance to make your case." Celeste hesitated. The idea of stepping into a public forum, especially one where people like Dean Mitchell might be present, was daunting. But Bethany's encouraging smile nudged her forward. "All right," Celeste said. "I'll be there." The town hall meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, its folding chairs arranged in neat rows beneath the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The room buzzed with conversation as Celeste took a seat near the back. The mayor, a sharp-eyed woman named Laura Grant, called the meeting to order. As the discussions moved from road repairs to local business concerns, Celeste waited for her moment to speak. When the topic shifted to healthcare, she stood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "My name is Dr. Celeste Harper," she began. "I've recently returned to Millwood to work at the clinic, and I'd like to address the critical need for more funding and resources." The room quieted as she outlined the challenges she'd encountered in just a few short days: patients unable to afford care, outdated equipment, and the overburdened staff. But as she spoke, she noticed Dean Mitchell leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed and a faint smirk on his face. When she finished, Dean stood. "Well, that's all very touching, Doc," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But the town's budget isn't exactly overflowing. Maybe we should focus on priorities that actually benefit everyone." Murmurs rippled through the room, some in agreement, others in protest. Celeste took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Healthcare does benefit everyone, Mr. Mitchell. A healthy community is a strong community. Ignoring these issues won't make them go away, it'll only make them worse." The tension in the room was palpable, but before Dean could respond, a young woman stood. "My name is Angela Jenkins," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I just want to say thank you, Dr. Harper. My brother passed away a few years ago because he couldn't get the care he needed. If we'd had a doctor like you back then, maybe he'd still be here." Her words hung in the air, silencing any further objections. As the meeting ended, several people approached Celeste to thank her, including Angela. But as Celeste walked to her car, she caught sight of Dean Mitchell watching her from across the parking lot, his expression unreadable. Celeste climbed into her car and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The road ahead was clearly going to be difficult, but Angela's words echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve. For the first time since returning to Millwood, Celeste felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. The tension of the town hall lingered with Celeste long after she had returned home. Sitting at her mother's kitchen table, she replayed Dean Mitchell's pointed remarks and the quiet ripple of murmurs that had followed. Angela Jenkins' raw and heartfelt words, however, stood out the most. "I just want to say thank you." Angela's voice echoed in her mind, grounding her as she gazed out the window at the overgrown yard. Those words reminded her why she had come back, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. The next morning, Celeste awoke with a renewed determination. She would not let the resistance of a few hold her back from helping the many. The clinic was already buzzing when she arrived. A line of patients stretched from the reception desk to the door, their faces a mix of weariness and expectation. Janie, the receptionist, was juggling phone calls and paperwork, her freckled face flushed with the effort. "Morning, Dr. Harper," Janie said, flashing a quick smile. "Hope you're ready. It's already shaping up to be one of those days." "Good morning," Celeste replied, slipping on her white coat. "Let's get to it." Her first patient was a young boy with a persistent cough. His mother, an exhausted woman in her early 30s, explained how she'd tried over-the-counter remedies, but nothing had worked. "I'm so sorry to bring him in again, Doc," the woman said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "But I didn't know where else to go." Celeste examined the boy carefully, her brow furrowing as she listened to his labored breathing. "You did the right thing," she assured the mother. "We'll get this figured out." After ordering a chest x-ray and prescribing medication, Celeste took a moment to sit with the woman, offering guidance on managing her son's condition at home. The gratitude in the mother's eyes was unmistakable. The day continued at a relentless pace, each patient's story adding to Celeste's growing understanding of the town's struggles. By the time she finally sat down for a quick lunch, her legs ached and her stomach growled, but there was a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Dr. King entered the break room, carrying a clipboard and a mug of coffee. He sat across from her with a tired sigh. "You're making quite an impression," he said, glancing up from his notes. "Good or bad?" Celeste asked with a small smile. "Depends on who you ask," King replied, his tone wry. "The patients seem to love you. As for the rest of the town, well, that's another story." Celeste nodded, recalling the town hall. "Dean Mitchell isn't going to make this easy, is he?" King chuckled dryly. "Dean doesn't like anything that threatens his way of doing things. He's got deep pockets and a lot of influence, but he's not invincible. If you stick to what's right, you'll outlast him." "I'm not here to pick fights," Celeste said, though a part of her bristled at the thought of backing down. "I just want to help." "And you are," King said firmly. "Don't lose sight of that." That evening, Celeste returned to her childhood home, her body weary, but her mind restless. After changing into comfortable clothes, she made a simple dinner and sat at the dining table. The silence of the house was both a comfort and a reminder of how much had changed since her parents' time. She was just finishing her meal when her phone buzzed with a text. "Derape. It's Angela Jenkins. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I just wanted to thank you again for what you said at the town hall. It means a lot to me and my family." Celeste stared at the message for a moment before typing a reply. "You're not bothering me at all. Thank you for speaking up. Your words made a difference." Angela responded almost immediately. "If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. We need more people like you in this town." The simple message warmed Celeste's heart. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Over the next week, Celeste began to notice subtle shifts in the clinic and the town. Patients were more willing to open up to her, and a few even mentioned hearing about her speech at the town hall. However, not all the feedback was positive. One afternoon, as she walked to her car after a long shift, she found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. "Go back to the city where you belong." Celeste's chest tightened as she read the words. She scanned the parking lot, but there was no one in sight. For a moment, she considered crumpling the note and throwing it away, but instead, she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. The message stung, but it also steeled her resolve. Whoever had written it didn't understand why she was here, and she wasn't about to let them drive her away. That Friday, Bethany Reed invited Celeste to join her for coffee at the community center. The warm, bustling space was a stark contrast to the lingering chill of the note. Bethany greeted her with a hug and handed her a steaming mug. "How's it going?" Bethany asked as they settled into a corner table. "Busy," Celeste replied with a tired smile. "But good. I think we're starting to make some progress." Bethany nodded. "I've been hearing a lot about you. Most of it's good, though I'm guessing you've had a few run-ins with the old guard." "You could say that," Celeste said, her mind drifting to Dean and the note. Bethany leaned forward, her expression serious. "Listen, you're doing something important, and important things always ruffle feathers. But you've got people in your corner, Celeste. Don't forget that." "Thanks, Bethany," Celeste said, her voice soft. "That means a lot." As they sipped their coffee, Bethany shared updates about the community center's programs, from after-school tutoring to food drives. Her passion was infectious, and Celeste found herself inspired by her friend's dedication. "We're actually hosting a health fair next month," Bethany said. "You should come. It'd be a great way to connect with more people in town." "I'd love to," Celeste said, already imagining the possibilities. That night, as Celeste drove home, she reflected on the week's events. There had been moments of doubt, moments of frustration, but there had also been glimmers of hope, Angela's gratitude, Bethany's support, and the small victories at the clinic. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed a familiar car parked across the street. It was Mrs. Beatrice Miller, her elderly neighbor. Beatrice stepped out, holding a covered dish in her hands. "Evening, Dr. Harper," Beatrice said, her voice warm. "Thought you might like some dinner. You've been working too hard to be cooking for yourself." Celeste smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. That's very kind of you." Beatrice handed her the dish, her eyes twinkling. "We're glad to have you back, Celeste. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Beatrice returned to her car, Celeste stood on the porch, the dish warm in her hands. For the first time in a long time, the weight of her challenges felt just a little lighter. The scent of Mrs. Miller's homemade casserole still lingered in the air as Celeste sat at her kitchen table later that evening, organizing patient notes. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the muted light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls. It had been a long week filled with small victories, like Angela Jenkins' gratitude, and moments of frustration, like Dean Mitchell's resistance. Yet, as Celeste flipped through her files, she felt a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The faint buzz of her phone pulled her out of her thoughts. She frowned as she glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The caller ID showed the clinic's number. "Dr. Harper," she answered, her voice calm but alert. "Sorry to bother you, Doc." Janie's voice came through, tinged with worry. "We just got a call. A boy's been hurt really bad. His mother is bringing him in now. Dr. King's tied up at the hospital, and you're the only one available." "I'm on my way," Celeste said without hesitation, grabbing her bag and keys. The clinic was eerily quiet when Celeste arrived, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on the empty waiting area. Janie stood behind the reception desk, her expression tense. "They just pulled up," Janie said, nodding toward the door. Moments later, the glass doors swung open, and a woman rushed in, cradling a boy in her arms. He couldn't have been more than 10, his face pale and his body limp. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm. "Please help him," the woman cried, her voice trembling. "Follow me," Celeste said firmly, leading them to an exam room. As the mother placed the boy on the exam table, Celeste's years of training kicked in. Her hands moved quickly, assessing the wound and checking his vitals. The gash on his arm was deep, but what concerned her more was the boy's shallow breathing and the bruises forming along his ribs. "What happened?" Celeste asked, her tone steady but urgent. The woman hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "He was attacked by some older kids. They jumped him on his way home, said he didn't belong in their neighborhood." Celeste felt a surge of anger, but kept her focus on the boy. "What's his name?" "Marcus," the woman replied, clutching her hands together. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Celeste asked gently, leaning close. The boy's eyelids fluttered, and he let out a weak groan. "Good," Celeste said, her voice soothing. "You're doing great, Marcus. Just stay with me." As she worked to stabilize him, Celeste couldn't shake the weight of the mother's words. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it reflected the same divisions that had simmered beneath Millwood's surface for decades. Once Marcus was stable, Celeste stepped out of the room to call the sheriff's office. The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent to the clinic immediately. When Celeste returned to the exam room, she found Marcus' mother pacing anxiously. "Is he going to be okay?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "He's stable now," Celeste said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But he'll need follow-up care to make sure there's no lasting damage." The woman nodded, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Dr. Harper. I didn't know what else to do. The hospital's so far, and I couldn't afford it anyway." "You did the right thing bringing him here," Celeste said firmly. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Celeste turned to see a sheriff's deputy enter the room. The officer, a tall man with a neatly pressed uniform, nodded briefly at Celeste before addressing the mother. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about what happened," he said, pulling out a notebook. The woman stiffened, her expression wary. "Is this going to help my son? Or are you just here to take notes?" The deputy hesitated, clearly taken aback by her tone. "I'll make sure your concerns are heard," Celeste interjected, her voice firm but measured. "Right now, we need to focus on keeping Marcus safe." The deputy stayed for nearly an hour, taking statements and asking questions. By the time he left, Marcus had fallen into a fitful sleep, and his mother's exhaustion was evident. Celeste offered her a seat in the waiting area and brought her a cup of tea from the break room. "You've been through a lot tonight," Celeste said gently as she handed her the cup. The woman nodded, her hands trembling as she held the mug. "I just don't understand. How could kids do something like this? Where does that kind of hate come from?" Celeste didn't have an easy answer. She thought of the note she'd found on her car, the veiled hostility in Dean Mitchell's words, and the unspoken divisions that ran through Millwood like invisible fences. "I don't know," Celeste admitted. "But what I do know is that you're not alone. There are people here who want to make things better, and I'll do everything I can to help." For the first time that night, the woman managed a faint smile. "Thank you. You're different from what I expected. In a good way." By the time Celeste finally left the clinic, the first hints of dawn were breaking over the horizon. She sat in her car for a moment, staring out at the quiet streets. The exhaustion in her body was undeniable, but so was the fire in her chest. The encounter with Marcus and his mother had left her shaken but resolute. The divisions in Millwood were deep, but they weren't unchangeable. As she pulled into her driveway, Celeste noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Mrs. Miller was once again sitting in her vehicle, her presence a quiet reassurance. Celeste stepped out of her car and crossed the street. "Up late again, Mrs. Miller?" she asked with a tired smile. Mrs. Miller chuckled softly. "Could say the same for you, Document. You're making waves in this town, you know. Good ones." "I hope so," Celeste said, her voice tinged with doubt. "You are," Mrs. Miller said firmly. "And don't let anyone tell you different." As Celeste walked back to her house, she felt a flicker of hope amidst the fatigue. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. The morning after the late-night emergency at the clinic, Celeste woke to the sound of rain tapping against her bedroom window. The steady rhythm provided a brief sense of calm, but her mind was already spinning. The incident with Marcus weighed heavily on her, a painful reminder of how deeply rooted the divisions in Millwood ran. She rose and went about her routine, her movements slower than usual. As she prepared breakfast, her phone buzzed with a message from Janie at the clinic. "Morning, Dr. Harper. Marcus and his mom stopped by earlier to say thanks again. Thought you'd want to know he's doing better." A small smile touched Celeste's lips as she read the text. It was a bright spot in a week that had otherwise felt heavy and uncertain. Later that morning, Celeste drove to the community center to meet Bethany Reed. The rain had let up, but the streets were still slick, and the gray sky cast a somber light over the town. The community center was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing against the walls, while volunteers organized supplies for an upcoming food drive. Bethany greeted Celeste with a quick hug and a cup of coffee. "You look like you could use this," Bethany said, studying her friend's tired expression. "Long night," Celeste replied, taking a grateful sip. Bethany led her to a quieter corner of the center, where they sat at a small table. "How's the clinic holding up?" Bethany asked. "We're managing," Celeste said. "But last night reminded me just how much this town still needs. It's not just about healthcare, it's about everything. Safety, education, trust." Bethany nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're right. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one step at a time." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly woman who shuffled toward their table with a cane. Celeste recognized her instantly, Mrs. Helen Green, one of Millwood's most prominent figures and the widow of a former mayor. "Excuse me," Mrs. Green said, her voice firm but polite. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." Bethany rose quickly, a look of surprise on her face. "Mrs. Green, it's so nice to see you. What brings you here today?" "I came to drop off some donations for the food drive," Mrs. Green replied, then turned her sharp gaze to Celeste. "And I wanted to meet Dr. Harper." Celeste stood and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Green." Mrs. Green clasped Celeste's hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I've been hearing a lot about you, Doctor. Seems you've made quite an impression in a very short time." "I'm just trying to help where I can," Celeste said. Mrs. Green's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's no small thing what you're trying to do. This town needs people with your kind of courage. But you'll find it's not always easy to move mountains, especially when there are people determined to keep them right where they are." Celeste met her gaze, sensing a depth of understanding in the older woman's words. "I've already seen some of that resistance, but I'm not planning to back down." Mrs. Green nodded approvingly. "Good. Millwood could use more people like you." To Celeste's surprise, Mrs. Green reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to Bethany, who looked inside and gasped. "This is a lot," Bethany said, her voice trembling. "It's for the clinic," Mrs. Green said matter-of-factly. "Use it to get what you need. Supplies, equipment, whatever will make a difference." Celeste blinked, momentarily stunned. "Mrs. Green, this is incredibly generous. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll put it to good use," Mrs. Green said with a wave of her hand. "I may not agree with everything going on in this town, but I can recognize when someone's trying to make it better." The donation sparked a flurry of activity at the clinic over the next few days. With Mrs. Green's support, Celeste and Dr. King were able to order new equipment, update outdated supplies, and even arrange for a part-time nurse to help ease the workload. The change was immediate and palpable. Patients noticed the improvements, and word began to spread about the positive developments at the clinic. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, as Celeste was finishing up with a patient, Janie appeared at the door, her expression nervous. "Dr. Harper, Dean Mitchell's here to see you," she said quietly. Celeste's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. "Send him to the break room," Celeste said, keeping her tone calm. When she entered the room, Dean was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed and his face set in a smug grin. "Dean," Celeste said, nodding in greeting. "Dr. Harper," he replied, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "Word around town is you're getting a little too ambitious with this clinic of yours." "I'm not sure what you mean," Celeste said, crossing her arms. Dean stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Let me spell it out for you. People don't like change, and they don't like outsiders coming in and telling them what's best for their town. You're stirring the pot, and it's going to cause problems." Celeste met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I'm here to provide care for people who need it. If that's stirring the pot, then so be it." Dean's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You be smart to keep things simple. Document don't make this harder than it needs to be." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Celeste standing alone in the room. That evening, as Celeste sat on her porch watching the rain, she thought about Mrs. Green's unexpected kindness and Dean's thinly veiled threat. For every step forward, there seemed to be a pushback, but Celeste refused to let that discourage her. She thought about Marcus, Angela Jenkins, and the other patients who had walked through the clinic's doors. They were the reason she had returned, and they were the reason she would keep fighting. As the rain softened to a drizzle, Celeste felt a renewed sense of resolve. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. The storm that had begun as a drizzle turned into a full-blown downpour by morning, and the gray sky mirrored Celeste's mood. As she pulled into the clinic's parking lot, the previous day's confrontation with Dean Mitchell replayed in her mind. His warning had been clear, and though she hadn't shown it, it had left a knot of unease in her chest. Inside the clinic, the atmosphere was busier than usual. The sound of ringing phones and hushed conversations filled the air. Janie was juggling patient files at the reception desk while a nurse checked supplies in the back room. "Morning, Dr. Harper," Janie greeted her, though her tone carried a note of tension. "Morning. What's going on?" Celeste asked, noticing the unusual energy in the room. "Word's been spreading about what you and Mrs. Green are doing here," Janie said, her voice low. "Most people are happy, but some, well, they're stirring the pot." Celeste sighed, already suspecting where the opposition was coming from. "Let me guess. Dean Mitchell?" Janie nodded. "He's been talking to folks. saying the clinic's pushing an agenda or that you're taking money from the wrong people. It's nonsense, but you know how quickly rumors spread around here. Celeste didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a moment to compose herself, then headed to her office to prepare for the day. By mid-afternoon, the waiting area was packed. Patients filled every chair, and a few stood near the door, chatting quietly as they waited. Celeste worked through appointments methodically, focusing on each case despite the lingering tension. Her last patient of the day was an older man with persistent chest pain. As she finished examining him and discussed next steps, the door to the exam room opened without warning. "Excuse me," Janie said, looking flustered. "Dr. Harper, there's a situation in the waiting area." "What kind of situation?" Celeste asked, already rising. Janie hesitated. "Dean Mitchell's here. He's arguing with one of the patients. It's starting to get heated." Celeste's heart sank, but she kept her expression calm. "I'll handle it." When Celeste stepped into the waiting area, the scene before her made her stomach tighten. Dean Mitchell stood near the reception desk, his arms crossed and his voice raised. Across from him was Angela Jenkins, her face flushed with anger. "I'm not going to let you intimidate me," Angela said firmly, her voice trembling slightly, but strong. "People like Dr. Harper are actually doing something to help this town, unlike you." Dean sneered. "You don't know what you're talking about. She's coming in here, changing things without understanding how this town works. It's reckless." "Dean," Celeste interrupted, stepping forward, her voice sharp and steady. "This is a clinic, not a town hall. If you have something to say, you can take it outside." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Dean's expression darkened. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Doc," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'm looking out for this town. Someone has to." "Looking out for the town?" Celeste replied, keeping her voice measured. "By attacking the people who are trying to make it better? If you have an issue with me, take it up with me directly. But don't come in here disrupting the care of the people who need it." Dean opened his mouth to respond, but the murmurs of agreement from the patients around him seemed to take the wind out of his sails. He cast a scathing look at Celeste before storming out. As the door swung shut behind him, Celeste turned to Angela. "Are you okay?" Angela nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm fine. I couldn't let him get away with talking like that." "Thank you," Celeste said softly. "You didn't have to stand up for me, but I'm glad you did." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. By the time Celeste locked up the clinic, her body ached with exhaustion, and her mind was a storm of emotions. She thought of Angela's bravery, Dean's hostility, and the silent support of the patients in the waiting room. When she arrived home, the quiet of the house felt heavier than usual. She heated leftovers for dinner, but barely touched her food, her appetite dulled by the weight of the day. As she sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed with a text message. It's Angela again. Just wanted to say thank you for standing up to Dean today. I know it wasn't easy, but people are watching, and it means a lot." Celeste stared at the message, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She typed a quick reply. "Thank you for speaking up. You're braver than you realize." The following day, Celeste received an unexpected visitor at the clinic. Mrs. Green arrived mid-morning, her sharp eyes scanning the waiting area before she approached the reception desk. "Mrs. Green," Celeste greeted her warmly. "What brings you here?" "I heard about the little incident yesterday," Mrs. Green said, her tone brisk, "and I wanted to make something clear." Celeste frowned, unsure of where the conversation was going. "You're doing good work here, Dr. Harper," Mrs. Green continued, "and I won't let people like Dean Mitchell or anyone else undermine it. If you need more support, financial or otherwise, you let me know. This town needs you more than it needs people like him." Celeste was momentarily speechless. She had expected kindness from Mrs. Green, but not such resolute support. "Thank you," Celeste said finally, her voice tinged with emotion. "That means more than you know." Mrs. Green nodded, her expression softening slightly. "You keep doing what you're doing, Doctor. The rest will take care of itself." That evening, as Celeste walked to her car, she noticed a small group of people gathered near the clinic's entrance. Angela was among them, along with Bethany Reed and a handful of other residents. "What's going on?" Celeste asked, stopping beside them. "We just wanted to show our support," Bethany said, smiling. After everything that happened yesterday, we thought you could use a reminder that you're not alone. Angela stepped forward, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. For you, Dr. Harper. Thank you for everything you're doing for this town. Celeste's throat tightened as she accepted the flowers. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't have to say anything, Bethany replied. Just keep going. We got your back. As Celeste drove home that night, the knot of tension in her chest began to loosen. The road ahead was still uncertain, but moments like these reminded her why she had returned to Millwood. Change was never easy, but with people like Angela, Bethany, and Mrs. Green by her side, it no longer felt impossible. The warmth of the wildflowers from Angela and the group lingered in Celeste's thoughts as she sat at her desk the next morning, staring at the delicate bouquet now placed in a coffee mug. It was a quiet reminder that amidst the tension and resistance, there was also support, and that support mattered. The clinic bustled around her, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been thinking about Bethany's health fair ever since the idea came up during their conversation at the community center. It felt like the perfect opportunity to connect with the people of Millwood and show what the clinic could do for the town. Her thoughts were interrupted by Dr. King stepping in her office, a folder tucked under his arm. You've been busy, he said with a faint smirk. I hear you've got half the town talking about some kind of health fair. I wouldn't say half the town, Celeste replied, smiling. But yes, I'm hoping it could be a way to bridge some of the gaps we're seeing. A chance for people to come together. King leaned against the doorframe, his expression turning serious. It's a good idea, but you know it'll bring out the skeptics too. You're painting a target on your back, Harper. I know, Celeste said, her voice steady. But it's worth the risk. People here need more than just Band-Aid solutions. They need to see what's possible when we work together. King studied her for a moment, then nodded. Well, if you're doing this, count me in. Just let me know how I can help. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Bethany and her team at the community center worked tirelessly alongside Celeste and the clinic staff to organize the event. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers signed up to help with logistics, and even Mrs. Green contributed funds to cover expenses. Despite the mounting excitement, Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that the fair's success would depend on more than just planning. The resistance she had faced from Dean Mitchell and others still loomed in the back of her mind. On the morning of the health fair, the sun rose bright and warm, cutting through the cool crispness of the early autumn air. The community center's parking lot had been transformed into a lively space filled with colorful booths, banners, and tables. Volunteers in matching t-shirts bustled about, setting up blood pressure stations, diabetes screenings, and educational displays on nutrition and exercise. A small corner was reserved for children, complete with games and face painting. As Celeste surveyed the setup, a wave of nervous energy swept through her. She glanced at Bethany, who stood nearby, clipboard in hand. How are we looking? Celeste asked. Everything's ready, Bethany replied. Now we just need people to show up. Celeste nodded, her stomach tightening. This was the moment they had been working toward. By mid-morning, the first trickle of attendees arrived. Elderly couples came for free health screenings. Parents brought their children to the play area, and young adults stopped by out of curiosity. Celeste moved from station to station, greeting attendees and answering questions. The positive energy was palpable, and for a moment, the divisions in the town seemed to melt away. Angela Jenkins arrived with her siblings, who rushed to the face-painting booth with wide grins. She waved at Celeste, her expression warm. You did it, Dr. Harper, Angela said when she approached. We did it, Celeste replied. This couldn't have happened without everyone's help. Angela smiled, glancing around at the bustling activity. I think this is exactly what Millwood needed. Not everyone shared Angela's optimism. Dean Mitchell arrived just before noon, his arms crossed as he surveyed the scene with a critical eye. He approached the main booth where Celeste was handing out pamphlets on affordable healthcare programs. Dr. Harper, Dean said, his tone neutral but laced with skepticism. Quite the event you've put together here. Thank you, Celeste replied, refusing to rise to his bait. Dean leaned closer, lowering his voice. But don't think this changed anything. A few screenings and pamphlets won't solve the problems in this town. People here don't need empty promises. Celeste met his gaze, her her voice calm but firm. This isn't about promises. It's about action. And whether you see it or not, people are responding. They want something better, and that's what we're working toward. Dean's lips pressed into a thin line. Without another word, he turned and walked away. As the day wore on, the crowd grew larger, and the atmosphere became even more vibrant. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and the steady hum of activity seemed to affirm that the event was a success. By late afternoon, Celeste found herself sitting at a table with a cup of lemonade, finally allowing herself a moment to relax. Bethany joined her, a satisfied smile on her face. "You should be proud," Bethany said. "This was a big deal, and you pulled it off." "It wasn't just me," Celeste replied. "This was a community effort." Bethany laughed softly. "You're too modest. But seriously, this is the kind of thing that makes people believe change is possible." Celeste glanced around at the bustling crowd, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and hope. Let's hope it's just the beginning. As the fair wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, Mrs. Green approached Celeste, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. "Well done, Doctor," Mrs. Green said, her tone approving. "You've shown this town what can happen when people come together. But don't get comfortable. The real work is just beginning." Celeste nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "I wouldn't expect anything less." That evening, as Celeste returned home, the exhaustion of the day finally caught up with her. She collapsed onto the couch, her body aching, but her spirit buoyed by the success of the fair. Her phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "Thank you for today. My siblings had so much fun, and I think my mom finally believes that things can get better. You're making a real difference." Celeste smiled as she read the message, her heart full. Despite the challenges, despite the resistance, moments like these reminded her why she had come back to Millwood. The road ahead would still be difficult, but the health fair had proven something important. Small victories mattered, and they could spark something much bigger. As she drifted off to sleep, the voices and laughter of the day lingered in her mind, a quiet affirmation that change was not only possible, but already happening. The health fair's success rippled through Millwood like a quiet but insistent tide. Over the following days, patients streamed into the clinic, many of them new faces who had learned about the facility during the event. Celeste noticed the subtle shift in attitudes. People were beginning to trust the clinic and, by extension, her. But not all changes were subtle. On a crisp Monday morning, as Celeste prepared for a day of appointments, Janie appeared at her office door, her expression a mix of surprise and urgency. "Dr. Harper," Janie said, "you've got a visitor. It's Dean Mitchell." Celeste froze for a moment, then exhaled slowly. She had been bracing for another confrontation ever since the fair, but Dean's arrival still sent a ripple of tension through her. "Send him in," she said, keeping her voice calm. When Dean entered, his usually smug demeanor was absent. His posture was stiff, his face pale, and his eyes carried an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Dr. Harper," he began, his voice subdued. "I need your help." Celeste blinked, startled by his tone. "What's going on?" "It's my granddaughter," Dean said, his words tumbling out quickly. "She's sick, fever, rash, trouble breathing. We don't know what's wrong, and the hospital's over an hour away. I didn't know where else to go." The sight of Dean Mitchell proud, stubborn Dean pleading for help, was disarming. But Celeste pushed her personal feelings aside. "Where is she now?" Celeste asked, already grabbing her stethoscope. "In the car," Dean said. "Bring her in," Celeste instructed. "We'll take care of her." Minutes later, Celeste was examining a small, frail girl no older than 5. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Dean hovered nearby, his usual confidence replaced with visible fear. "What's her name?" Celeste asked. "Maddie," Dean replied, his voice breaking slightly. Celeste worked quickly, her mind racing as she checked Maddie's vitals and examined her symptoms. She suspected a severe allergic reaction, but ordered tests to confirm. "She's stable for now," Celeste said, glancing at Dean. "But she'll need treatment immediately. If we don't act fast, this could become life-threatening." Dean nodded, his jaw tight. "Do whatever you have to do." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Celeste administered treatment and monitored Maddie closely, her focus unwavering. Dean remained in the corner of the room, silent but visibly shaken. When Maddie's breathing finally steadied and her fever began to subside, Celeste allowed herself a moment to exhale. "She's going to be okay," Celeste said, her voice soft but firm. Dean's shoulders sagged with relief, and he muttered a quiet, "Thank you." After Maddie was settled, Dean lingered outside the exam room, waiting for Celeste. "I owe you an apology," he said when she approached. His tone was low, almost hesitant. "For what?" Celeste asked, though she already knew. "For doubting you," Dean said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "For questioning your intentions. I thought you were just here to stir things up, but I was wrong. You saved my granddaughter's life." Celeste studied him for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "It's my job, Dean. I would have done the same for anyone." "But you didn't have to," Dean replied, finally meeting her eyes. "Not after how I've treated you. I see that now. And I want you to know, I am grateful." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Celeste saw a glimmer of the man beneath the bluster. "I appreciate that," Celeste said finally. "But gratitude isn't enough, Dean. If you really want to make things right, start by supporting the changes this town needs." Dean nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'll think about it." The encounter with Dean left Celeste both relieved and unsettled. She had seen the cracks in his defenses, but she wasn't sure if his gratitude would translate into action. Later that evening, she shared the day's events with Bethany over coffee at the community center. "Do you think he'll change?" Bethany asked, her brow furrowed. "I don't know," Celeste admitted, "but I think today was a start. People don't change overnight, but sometimes it takes a personal experience to open their eyes." Bethany nodded. "It sounds like you made an impact. That's more than most people can say when it comes to Dean Mitchell." In the days that followed, word of Celeste's efforts with Maddie spread through the town. Patients arrived at the clinic not just for medical care, but to thank her for her dedication. Even Mrs. Green stopped by, her expression softer than usual. "You're earning their trust, Dr. Harper," Mrs. Green said. "One step at a time." Celeste smiled. "I hope so. This town has a lot of healing to do physically and otherwise." One afternoon, as Celeste was leaving the clinic, she noticed a figure waiting near her car. It was Dean. "Dr. Harper," he called, his tone measured. "What can I do for you, Dean?" Celeste asked, her guard still slightly raised. "I've been thinking about what you said," Dean began. "About supporting change." "And?" Celeste prompted. Dean hesitated, then extended a hand. "I want to help. Tell me what I can do." For a moment, Celeste was stunned. She hadn't expected Dean to come around so quickly, if at all. But as she looked at him, she saw the genuine resolve in his expression. "Let's start with the clinic," Celeste said, shaking his hand. "We've got a long way to go, but if we work together, I think we can make a real difference." That night, as Celeste sat on her porch, she reflected on the week's events. The health fair had sparked something in Millwood, but the real change was happening in the small, quiet moments like Dean's apology, Angela's continued support, and Mrs. Green's encouragement. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Celeste felt like the tide was turning. The town wasn't perfect. It might never be, but the cracks in its foundation were beginning to heal, and Celeste knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The brisk autumn air carried a hint of wood smoke as Celeste stepped out of her car and onto the gravel lot of the Millwood Community Center. She paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the building alive with activity. Volunteers were bustling inside, arranging chairs and hanging colorful banners for a town meeting that promised to be unlike any other Millwood had seen. Celeste adjusted her coat against the chill and made her way inside. Bethany was waiting near the entrance, clipboard in hand, her expression a mix of excitement and nerves. "You ready for this?" Bethany asked, offering a small smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," Celeste replied, her voice steady. The town meeting had been called to discuss a bold new proposal, expanding the clinic services and creating a community health initiative that would address not just medical care, but also education, nutrition, and mental health. It was an ambitious plan, and Celeste knew it would face resistance. But she also knew it was a chance to reshape Millwood into a healthier, more unified town. By the time the meeting began, the gymnasium was packed. Residents filled the folding chairs, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: curiosity, skepticism, and cautious hope. At the front of the room, Celeste sat beside Bethany, Mrs. Green, and an increasingly familiar figure, Dean Mitchell. Though Dean's presence had initially drawn murmurs, his recent efforts to support the clinic had begun to change how people viewed him. Celeste wasn't sure if his transformation was complete, but his willingness to stand beside her tonight was a step she hadn't thought possible just weeks ago. Mayor Laura Grant called the meeting to order, her voice carrying a note of authority as she outlined the evening's agenda. Then she turned to Celeste. "Dr. Harper, the floor is yours." Celeste stood, her palms briefly brushing the fabric of her slacks to steady herself. The room fell silent as she stepped to the podium, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Good evening," she began. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Celeste Harper. I returned to Millwood a few months ago to work at the clinic, but my connection to this town runs much deeper than my job. This is where I grew up, and it's a place I still believe in." Her voice grew steadier as she continued. "Over the past few weeks, I've had the privilege of caring for many of you and your families. I've seen firsthand the strength and resilience of this community, but I've also seen the challenges we face, challenges that require more than any one person or clinic can solve." She paused, letting the words settle. "That's why I'm here tonight, with the support of so many of you, to propose a new vision for Millwood. One where healthcare isn't just about treating illnesses, but about building a foundation of wellness for everyone. This initiative isn't just about the clinic, it's about schools, families, and neighborhoods coming together to create lasting change." The room was quiet, save for the soft rustling of papers and the creak of chairs. Celeste glanced at Bethany, who gave her an encouraging nod and continued. "I know change can be difficult," Celeste said, her tone gentle but firm. "But I believe this is the kind of change that can transform lives, and I'm asking for your trust and your support to make it happen." As Celeste stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. The mayor opened the floor for questions, and as expected, not all of them were friendly. "How are we supposed to pay for this?" a man near the back called out, his voice sharp with skepticism. Celeste answered calmly, explaining how grants, partnerships, and community fundraising could make the initiative feasible without placing undue strain on taxpayers. "What if it doesn't work?" another voice asked. "Then we learn and adapt," Celeste replied. "But doing nothing guarantees that nothing changes." Dean Mitchell stood next, drawing surprised looks from the crowd. "I'll admit," Dean began, his voice measured, "I wasn't sure about this at first. I fought it, in fact. But I've seen what this town can accomplish when we put aside our differences and focus on what really matters. Dr. Harper's vision isn't just possible, it's necessary." His words carried weight, and Celeste noticed a shift in the room. The skepticism began to soften, replaced by tentative optimism. After the meeting ended, Celeste lingered in the gymnasium as people filtered out. Angela Jenkins approached her, her younger siblings trailing behind. "You were amazing," Angela said, her voice brimming with pride. "Thank you," Celeste replied, smiling. "We've got your back," Angela added. "Whatever you need, just say the word." Moments later, Mrs. Green joined them, leaning on her cane but standing tall. "Well done, doctor," she said. "You've given this town something to believe in." "Let's hope it's enough," Celeste said softly. "It will be," Mrs. Green said firmly, "because you're not doing it alone." In the weeks that followed, the community health initiative began to take shape. Local businesses donated funds and supplies. Schools organized wellness programs, and volunteers poured their time and energy into the project. Dean Mitchell, true to his word, used his connections to rally support, and his change in demeanor started to win over even his harshest critics. For Celeste, the work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. She saw the results in the faces of her patients, in the laughter of children during community events, and in the gratitude of people who had once been strangers but now felt like neighbors. One crisp evening, as Celeste walked through Millwood's main square, she noticed something that made her pause. The once empty storefronts were beginning to show signs of life, new businesses opening, windows decorated with bright displays. Bethany joined her, carrying a bag of groceries. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Bethany said, following Celeste's gaze. "It does," Celeste replied. "Like the town's waking up." Bethany smiled. "That's because of you, you know. It's because of all of us," Celeste said, her voice filled with quiet pride. That night, Celeste returned home and sat on her porch, gazing at the stars. The weight of the past months had lightened, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and hope. Her phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "The town feels different, Dr. Harper. Thank you for coming back." Celeste smiled as she typed a reply. "It's not just me, Angela. It's all of us." As she set the phone down, Celeste felt a deep sense of peace. Millwood still had its challenges, but the cracks in its foundation were beginning to heal. And for the first time, Celeste knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.